All right, what's going on, everyone? We're going to step back today from battlefield updates during the war in Ukraine to more big picture items that have the ability to affect the outcome of the war if they swing in one direction or the other. So, these are a couple things that are three specifically that have been on my mind since day one, and it's something I always try to keep an eye on. These are things that are pretty hard to measure, partially because the information we're going to get into, neither Ukraine nor Russia want to release publicly. It's in their best interest to keep it close held. But even if we did have it, there's so many other little variables at play that just getting a number doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture. Now, in my opinion, one of these is net even between the two countries. One favors Russia and one favors Ukraine. We're going to talk about manpower, equipment available for the fight, and domestic support. All right, starting out with manpower or number of troops available for the fight, that's probably the easiest to compare between Russia and Ukraine. But even then, there's so many variables that it's not simply a matter of comparing two numbers. I mean, you have to consider age, training, ability, willingness to fight, equipment they're fighting with, leadership, and quite a bit more. And for all of the very valid arguments of quantity versus quality, numbers do matter. There's a quote here I've always heard attributed to Napoleon, but in looking it up to confirm for this video, I actually saw it tied to Joseph Stalin. But anyways, the quote is, "Quantity has a quality all its own." And in a war of attrition, how many soldiers you can afford to lose plays an outsized role. Overall, Russia holds the advantage in available manpower to place under arms. Their population pre-war was roughly 3 to 4 times that of Ukraine. So long-term, isolating this one factor, we can likely assume that Russia will be able to field more soldiers than Ukraine will. Now, since the start of the war, Ukraine has actually had a manpower advantage on the battlefield. It's very, very hard to figure out exactly how many soldiers each side has committed to the fight, but when the invasion kicked off, it was estimated to be around a 1-to-1 ratio with 200,000 soldiers each. Ukraine quickly mobilized and began pulling more people into the army, and I've seen some estimates that they may have peaked around 1 million total under arms. That seems a little high. I feel like 300 to 600,000 is probably more in the appropriate range. But either way, that means Ukraine has had more soldiers on the battlefield throughout this entire war than Russia. On Russia's end, their main effort to backfill losses came via mobilization in September of about 300,000 additional men. Not all of them have been committed to the front lines as of mid-December. It sounds like maybe 10% or so. But if all of those do move to the battlefields in Ukraine, that would at least move the two numbers closer to that 1-to-1 ratio they started with. You got to take these numbers with a huge grain of salt. The casualty figures on both sides are pretty closely held. Actual numbers of troops in formation is also not widely released. So very big brush overviews when we're talking in the 300 to 600,000 range. So if we're looking at a long-term war of attrition like we're starting to see play out in Ukraine, as opposed to a quick fall of one of the two countries, available soldiers will very much come into play. If we're not already there, I got to imagine that Ukraine relatively soon is going to reach their cap of how many people can be armed fighting the Russians. Simply based on population size, Russia should have some room to expand their military even after this 300,000 mobilization. Quick note on foreign volunteers fighting for Ukraine. There have been quite a few that have joined their ranks, but estimates I've seen range from the hundreds into the couple of thousands. So I think it's safe to say the foreign volunteers make up less than 10,000 fighters overall in Ukraine. I'm sure some will trickle in over the next few weeks and months, but we're not talking about like a huge force here. Overall, Ukraine's defense has been and will continue to largely fall on their own citizens doing the fighting. Now, the differences in manpower is nothing new. It was something well known, obviously, before the war, and I'm sure continues to be a major planning factor today. The second item is resources, or in this case, equipment available to execute the war. This is an area that Russia started the war as a heavy favorite. They had more tanks, artillery, planes, missiles, everything than Ukraine did, and it really wasn't all that close. Western aid has picked up substantially to try to level that playing field, but even today, Russia still does hold that advantage in overall equipment available to put into the fight. Again, there's always a very valid argument between quantity and quality. That's just something that's really hard to compare and contrast. But however you want to dial that in, both sides are chewing through resources and are in constant need of more. On Ukraine's side, they've largely depleted their Soviet-era weapons and munitions and increasingly are more and more reliant on Western aid to stay in the fight. In the short term, providing that aid continues as it has, that gives Ukraine access to some of the most advanced, best military technology all around the world. Essentially, Ukraine has the full backing in terms of supply from NATO and quite a few other Western countries, providing equipment from more than a dozen arsenals all around the world. On the downside, if international support were to wane, Ukraine's unlikely to be able to continue the war at its current tempo. Even if support maintains, there's an issue of manufacturing capacity, especially in the United States, that has to be addressed. There's a recent article out, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, maybe New York Times, either way, I'll link it below, but it talked about how Ukraine is going through more ammunition than the United States is on track to produce. Now, we do have stockpiles we're pulling from in the United States, but long term, if you're consuming more than you're producing, that's going to be a problem. Now, when that really becomes a problem isn't exactly public information, but it does seem like it's at least on a radar right now. For example, one of these articles said that the U.S. produces 5,000 Gimlers per year. That's the Mike 3-1. It's the guided rocket fired out of the HIMARS. We produce 5,000 a year, and they said that over the last few months, we've sent Ukraine between 8 and 10,000 of those rounds. On top of that, the Army said that they're going to increase production of their 155 millimeter artillery shells from 14,000 a month right now to 20,000 a month by spring and 40,000 a month by 2025. But you want to know how much ammo is being used in this war? Midsummer, there were estimates that Russia was firing upwards of 20,000 artillery rounds per day, and Ukraine between 6 and 10,000 per day. Now, I'm sure that number probably includes rockets, missiles, mortars. I don't know. It seems very loose, but it gives you an idea. Ukraine was firing nowhere near the amount that Russia was, and they would still blow through 1 month's worth of production in 2, maybe 3 days. That level of consumption is far outpacing production. Now, how does all of that compare with Russia? That's the big question, right? It's kind of a matter of pick your poison. Russia had larger stockpiles than Ukraine at the beginning of the war. They manufacture, at least at a high level, their own military equipment and ammunition, but are under economic sanctions that are slowly appearing to make some sort of impact. There's another recent New York Times article talking about how recent missile strikes in Ukraine, they recovered some of the parts from those munitions, and they showed that they were built just this last summer after sanctions had gone into place, which is just a reminder that these sanctions don't shut down all production, but they should, if they're working, make things harder to produce. So in this case, entirely possible that Russia had everything they needed on hand for a summer production run of this specific type of missile. Maybe they were able to develop in-house their own version so they didn't have to import it from the United States or elsewhere, or maybe they picked it up on the black market. Any one of those are a possibility. In terms of aid from other countries, Russia isn't getting as much as Ukraine, but there is still some. As of today, mid-December, it appears that Iran, North Korea, and Belarus have all sent military equipment or ammunition to Russia to be used in Ukraine. Now, a little different relationship between Russia and those three countries than there is with Ukraine and NATO. I would say Ukraine is more asking NATO for assistance, and that decision probably sits within NATO leadership, whereas Russia might have an ability to more dictate to these three countries what support they need. Now, real quick on the idea or the commentary from a few months ago that Russia is out or running out of missiles. I think it's fair to say that Russia has expended far more munitions than they had allocated to use in this war. It's hard to imagine that anybody inside Russia was planning on a 70 missile barrage being needed 9 months after the invasion kicked off. I'd be surprised if their missile production is keeping up with their current rates of production. That would mean that after a couple decades of kind of minimal use, they somehow doubled or tripled their production in a matter of months while under sanctions. That's a big ask. The more likely scenario is that while working to increase their missile production, they've begun pulling from existing stores set aside for other purposes, very similar to the drawdowns that have been happening here in the United States. So technically, yes, you could say Russia is running low on missiles because they have fewer now than at the beginning of the war, but I think that statement makes it seem like their inventory is about to run completely out, and I'm just not sure that's exactly the case. So who the resources favor is a tricky one, because if international support turns, Ukraine is likely out of the war. But if that aid persists, I'd be willing to bet more on Western manufacturing capacity over what Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and Iran can put together. But for that advantage to matter, Ukraine has to stay in the fight, which brings us to the third part, domestic support. Dan Carlin has a great podcast on World War I where he talks about measuring a military by its ability to take a punch and keep on going. And this isn't just talking about those in the front line, it ties in a level of support from the population as a whole. So, right now, both Russia and Ukraine are feeling the impact of this war, albeit to different degrees. For Ukraine, it's right in their face. Their cities are being destroyed, their power is going out midwinter, and they all likely know someone who has died fighting in this war. And as the war drags on, Russians are starting to feel the impact of this war as well, just a little bit differently. There are funerals and death announcements that are stacking up faster than many expected. Sanctions are starting to have some sort of impact. It's up for debate. And a large number of citizens have fled the country or have been pulled into military service. There's no keeping this war completely separate from the public at this point. But measuring public support is a little bit tricky, especially from the outside. I recognize here in the United States, I have access to far more Ukrainian-sourced media than Russian, which is going to impact how I gauge something as vague as public support. I mean, every day I can see generally pro-Ukrainian news from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, all of NATO, and more. But pro-Russian news is really only coming out of Russia. There's just a discrepancy in volume that's hard to account for, and each side rightfully recognizes the importance of public support and in turn focuses on more positive stories than the negative. So of these three, public support is the only one, to me at least, that has the ability to change the course of the war today for either side. Weapons and munitions available are more of a medium-term concern that has to be resolved sometime in the next 4 to 6 months. And to me at least, the brighter outlook there favors Ukraine. Finally, personnel differences are likely to play the largest role long-term. Take 6+ months down the road of continued attritional warfare. I'm not sure there's a way for Ukraine to overcome this discrepancy, which means they can't afford to trade casualties anywhere near a 1-to-1 ratio with Russia, or they're just going to run out of soldiers available for the fight. All right, that's all I got for now. Just some big picture things that I'm always thinking about when trying to keep up with this war. I have a feeling that each one of these are the kind of things we'll read about in the future when the conflict is over. It's not going to be, a breaking news headline in a week, a month, or whatever. But anyways, let me know what you think. We'll see you next time.